Good evening, everyone, especially to our dear instructor, Ma'am Juliet Tanseco. Good evening po, ma'am. My name is Ruby Jane Tizan Abaigar, and tonight, I'll be discussing the characteristics of good learning outcomes. But before I start, let me first define what is learning outcomes. So, learning outcomes, it is a statement that describes knowledge or skills a student should acquire at the end of the particular assignment, class, course, program, and it helps students understand why that knowledge or those skills will be useful to them. So, always remember that it is really important to define learning outcomes as clearly and explicitly as possible. By providing clear and comprehensive learning outcomes, faculty begin to provide a transparent pathway for student success. These are the characteristics of good learning outcomes. First, good learning outcomes are centered on the student or learner. This is the reason why learning outcomes are referred to as student learning outcomes. Good learning outcomes are learner-centered. They describe what the learner is able to do as a result of teaching. Like what I've said earlier, learning outcomes describe the knowledge or value, measurable skills, abilities that a student should be able to demonstrate as a result of completing a course. They are student-centered rather than teacher-centered. So in short, it describes what the students will do, not what the instructor will teach. Here is an example. The learner is able to write a paragraph that observes unity, coherence, variety. To teach the students how to write a good paragraph is not learner-centered. It is a teacher-centered instead. It is a teaching objective, not a learning outcome. Teaching objectives belong to the teacher, while learning outcomes belong to the learner. Second, good learning outcomes are based on and aligned with the institutional, program, and course outcomes. It is in aligning learning outcomes with institutional outcomes that educational institutions realize their intended institutional outcomes. It is in aligning learning outcomes with intended program outcomes issued by a regulating body, in the case of the Philippines, the Commission on Higher Education, that the program outcomes are also realized. It is in aligning the learning outcomes to the course outcomes that each course or subject in the teacher education curriculum attains its course outcome. And the second characteristics of good learning outcomes, dapat based on and aligned with the institutional, program, and course outcomes. When we say institutional learning outcomes, it is the knowledge, skills, abilities, and attitudes that students are expected to develop as a result of their overall experiences with any aspect of the college, including courses, programs, and student services. So the purpose of institutional learning outcomes are designed to help guide individual department and disciplines in the development of student learning outcomes for programs and courses and services, and to help shape the decision-making processes of the college. Having good learning outcomes, it is also based on alignment of learning outcomes with course and program, where there is consistency across the program with precise connection between evaluations, course, goals, and learning tasks. It is important to align learning objective with instructional strategies and assessment to ensure that everyone involved is aware of the expectations. Good learning outcomes are based on and aligned with local, national, and international trends and issues. From the local social reconstructionist point of view, schools are not ivory towers. They are expected to help address social problems and so for relevance. It is necessary that learning outcomes are based on and aligned with current issues. Aligning learning outcomes with local, national, and international issues ensures teaching learning that is relevant and attuned to the local and global world of learning. Fourth, good learning outcomes are known and are very well understood by students and faculty. The learning outcomes are no secret for the teacher only. In fact, in OBE and OBTL, the teacher starts the lesson with a clarification of the learning outcomes to ensure that each student knows what is or are expected of him or her. Some teachers have the commendable practice of writing the learning outcome on the board. Good learning outcomes include a spectrum of thinking skills from simple remembering to creating, or from the lowest and the simplest cognitive, and a structural process to cognitive in Bloom's and Anderson's revised taxonomy of objectives. So you have learned this in the first course on assessment in Learning 1, right? For a review, Bloom's and Anderson's taxonomy of objectives are given here. Look at the figure 7. This is the Bloom's and Anderson's taxonomy of objectives. First, creating. Second, evaluating. Third, analyzing. Fourth, understanding. And last is remembering. So in creating, the student create a new product of point of view to assemble, construct, create, design, develop, formulate, write, or invent. Evaluating. The student might appraise, argue, defend, judge, select, support, value, and evaluate. Analyzing. Student would be able to choose, demonstrate, dramatize, employ, illustrate, interpret, operate, sketch, solve, use, or write. Remembering. Student would be able to define, duplicate, list, memorize, recall, repeat, reproduce, or state. Other than Bloom's taxonomy, the most popular among taxonomies of objectives are other taxonomies of learning objectives that include simple thinking skills and higher order thinking skills. Below are taxonomies of McTighe and Wiggins, Manzano, Fink and Biggs, and Collins. All of these taxonomies of objectives include objectives from the lowest to the highest levels. McTighe and Wiggins, McTighe 2018 and their Understanding by Design or UBD described 4 K types of educational goals: knowledge, basic skills, long-term understanding, and long-term transference goals. They also cited 6 facets of understanding. Knowledge goals specify the knowledge that students should know, while basic skills state what students should be able to do. Understanding goals refer to students' grasp of big ideas. Learners' understanding is demonstrated when they can explain, interpret, apply, have perspective, empathize, and have self-knowledge. When we say explain, it is provide explanation. Interpret, it is identify means. Apply, use knowledge in new situation. Have perspective, it is see viewpoints through critical eyes. Empathize, it is able to find value in what others may find odd. And last, have self-knowledge, aware of what they do not understand. Fink's Taxonomy for Significant Learning, Fink 2003, includes: first, caring. It is developing new feelings, interests, and values. Second, learning how to learn. It is becoming a self-directed learner. Third, integration. It is a connections. Fourth, human dimension. It is a learning about self and others. Fifth, application. Skills like critical, creative, and practical thinking. And the last is foundational knowledge. It is understanding and remembering. Like Bloom and Anderson, Manzano, Fink, McTighe, and Wiggins, Biggs also begin with the simplest cognitive skill. See Biggs' solo taxonomy. This is the figure 8, the structure of the observed learning outcomes or solo. The structure of the observed learning outcome or solo, it means of classifying learning outcomes in terms of their complexity. Learning becomes more complex as it progresses. Teaching learning begins with one or few aspects of the task is called unstructural. Then tackling several aspects of the task are related, and so tasks that are independent of each other is called multi-structural. Then integrating the multiple aspects into a whole is called relational. And finally, generalizing into something abstract is called extended abstract. So, see the behavioral terms that apply per level. In summary, all the taxonomies of objectives or outcomes discussed in the foregoing paragraphs begin with the cognitive process at the lowest level becoming more complex and the higher in level as one goes higher in the taxonomy of objectives. Good learning outcomes are concerned not only with the cognitive process in the lower level like remembering, but also with more complex outcomes in the higher cognitive level such as applying, evaluating, and creating. Good learning outcomes are SMART. It is specific, measurable, attainable, result-oriented, and time-bound. To discuss everything that you learned from this course is not a good learning outcomes. It is specific, but to illustrate with a concrete example at least 5 principles of learning is good learning outcomes. So, good learning outcomes are stated using behavioral terms. Good learning outcomes are useful and relevant to the learners. The learning outcomes are for the learners to attain at the end of the lesson. It is easier for the learners to realize the learning outcomes if they are of use and of relevance to them. So, if the learning outcomes are relevant, the learners see the importance or significance of realizing the learning outcomes in their life. It is quite difficult for learners to learn something which has no relevance to their life.